Okay, I was recently asked to do a notching video, or to take a so-called deep dive into notching and explain everything I know about notching, I'm assuming. So what I'm going to do is try my best at showing you how I do the notching on my points, and plus I'll practice up on some other techniques that I don't normally use. Now, notching is different from bifacing in at least three different very important ways. Notching is not really concerned with thinning, although you can thin from a notch, but you have to use a certain kind of platform. I might get into that later. This is going to probably be a several part series because notching can get very technical, and I assume that's why I was asked to do it, because it is one of those things that can be heavily involved, and techniques can vary significantly, both in the way you do it and the results you get. And there are ways to cheat at notching. One of the ways is to use a diamond file if you get something called stalling. Even if you don't get stalling, you can use it as an abrader, which is one of the main differences between bifacing and notching. Is notching uses very little of the same abrading techniques that you use on a regular biface edge. Now, on actual artifacts, for those of you who are just tuning in, on actual artifacts, I have shown in some of my previous videos there's not much abrading in bifacing either, right? So I think many of the Native Americans were not abrading the notching or the bifacing, but I am going to show you ways to do that anyway on the notching part, how to abrade the base or the bottom or the foot of the notch. I think there's maybe a couple more terms that are used for the bottom of notches. But anyway, I'll just get started. The easiest way to notch is on a very thin piece. Look how thin this flake is, right? If I wanted to notch an arrowhead that thin, let's zoom in here. All I gotta do is start crunching in. Where do they start? Yeah. Just start crunching in with a flat tool, kind of like a screwdriver tip or a chisel tip. All right, just scratch it in like this. Scratch, and there you go. You have your notch. And if it's still very thin at the bottom of the notch, you can keep going, scratching, or what I call scratching. Flip, scratch, flip and scratch. And there you go. There you go. You have a notch. Okay? So, what do we learn from that experience? The thinner the piece, the easier it is to notch. Now, you could ruin it, so it's not really that easy. You can scratch too hard and blow away the edge. Blowing away is just a flint-knapping term for fracturing the edge in an undesirable way by removing too much of it. But yeah, a notch is extremely easy to do on a thin piece. Now, what if I want to notch something thick? Let's see. I think that's where the challenge comes in, right? How do you notch something thick? Because it can't be the question of how to notch something thin. So that's the easiest thing in the world. Well, how do you notch something thick? Well, you try not to, number one. Number two, you're going to need a lot more force. Number three, it depends on the stone you're using. Some thick stones are easily notched, some are not. Most are not. Most thick stuff is a real pain to notch. I'm going to show you how to notch everything. Extremely thin, extremely thick, and everything in between, hopefully in this series. One thing I can tell you that I do personally, if I want to notch something, or if I know I'm going to notch something, I want to use something heat treated or something easy to nap. If I'm going to be notching, I don't want to be working on rhyolite or quartzite or something impossible to flake. You're just asking for trouble. Okay. Can you notch those? A lot of you guys would say, well, I've seen Native American artifacts made out of really tough material with beautiful notches that I cannot seem to get. First question is, how do you know it's really tough? It might look really tough. How do you know it's really tough? The notching would lend you to think that the material isn't really that tough by virtue of being able to be notched. Have you thought of that part? If you can notch it well, chances are it's not difficult to notch. But let's say it is difficult to notch, and let's say the Native Americans found a way to notch really, really thick pieces. How do they do it? Well, the answer to that is, well, we will never know. The short answer, because we weren't there. But we can develop different ways to do it, right? Using natural materials. One of the best ways I've found to notch difficult materials with natural tools is punch notching, or vertical punches. I'll get into that in a different video after I get more practice. But in short, vertical punch notching just puts the tool on the edge of the bottom of the notch, and you apply hammer type force to the back of the flaker. This is a vertical, what they call a vertical punch, because the force is in line with the length of the tool, and it's usually positioned in a vertical manner. It's a vertical punch, as opposed to a horizontal punch where you strike from the side. Now you can also notch from the side with a horizontal punch by striking the side of the flaker. You don't have to strike the base and mount it in a vertical position. You can mount it onto the edge in a horizontal position and strike off indirect percussion flakes like you would be when you're working on indirect percussion on the edge to thin the piece. Okay, but I said, you know, you're not really thinning the piece when you're notching, although you can do it as part of an advanced technique. I'll show you how to do that. Right now, I'm just going to show you basics on notching and what you need to start out with. Right? You need to start out with a nice material that's easy to nap, a tool that's shaped in the right way, and a thin piece. If the tool is not shaped in the right way, and the workpiece is thick, or it's difficult to nap, it's going to be very difficult to notch. Now, I have some natural materials for tools. I'll show you how to do the abo notching or the natural tool notching as well. But I'm starting the series with the steel. This is a steel nail. The easiest thing to make is a steel tool. So that's what I'm going to show you first. I'm going to go through a bunch of steel tools, vertical punches, pressure flakers, horizontal punches in steel. Okay, with different material. I got some other material, but I don't have any raw stuff within reach. Let's see. This piece might be raw. But anyway, in this particular 30-minute segment, I'm going to go into the basic procedure of notching. I have another notching video where it's notching for beginners. If you want to search my channel, Jack Crafty Notching or Jack Crafty Beginner Notching, you can see that one. But that one's pretty old. Okay, so I want to do a new series with only notching. Okay, so 10 minutes in and I haven't really done too much. People want to see how to notch something thick. Like I said, I think thin stuff is very easy. I'm trying to think of how do I demonstrate that in the easiest way possible. Let me see. Let me think here. You're going to need a lot of force for something thick. Oh yeah, one thing I did forget. There's kind of like a rule in notching. Your notch probably won't be more narrow than the workpiece is thick. So you measure the thickness, take your calipers. Let's see. I got it in here somewhere. Okay. I got everything crammed into a box right now. All right, so you take a measurement of the thickness. This one is what, 5.5 millimeters? Let's just say 5, right? Your notch, if your notch is 5, let's see, where did I take the measurement? If your notch is 5 wide, it's going to be a fairly easy time. It's when the width of the notch is smaller in measurement than the thickness of your workpiece that you run into problems. Everybody wants to know how to make very narrow notches on really thick pieces. Because if you could do that, a lot of your problems are solved. That you don't need to create a thin piece and you can make some beautiful notches. So that's what I'll be getting into. How do you make narrow notches on thick pieces? Making a narrow notch on a thin piece just requires a thinner tool and a lot of careful scratch, flip, scratch, flip, scratch, and flip. When we start to get into the thicker stuff, it requires a lot more concentrated force, a lot more paying attention to how you create the platform at the base of that notch and angles, and actually the study of how to produce Hertzian cones. Hertzian cones are more relevant in notching than they are in thinning. Much more relevant. So the Hertzian cone is going to rear its ugly head with notching. And I say its ugly head because the cone shape itself lends itself to blowing away the sides of the notch. If you pop out a big old cone shaped flake, it tends to want to remove the sides of your notch. So the Hertzian cones have to be directed inward. If you're pushing downward mainly, the Hertzian cone going downward is going to have a greater chance of blowing away the sides of your notch. Now it doesn't matter too much as you go inward. The further you're inward, the more vertical you can punch or press. But in the beginning, you're going to be doing this or even scratching at this angle. You're not going to be vertical. You're going to be carefully directing the Hertzian cone inward, not downward. Okay? Now, inward force can be done in two ways. You can either rest the tool on the surface, push downward, or you can bite into the edge of the bottom of that notch and then push downward. Either way works, and sometimes I use a combination of the two, depending on how it's going. If it seems to be popping out flakes better by resting the tool on top and pushing downward, I'll use that. But if it seems like it's working better if I bite or press into the edge and then move downward and inward, I'll do that if it's better. Okay? Now, is the shape of the tool important? Well, yes. Some guys like to use sharp corners on their notchers because that concentrates the force. And I mentioned already that concentration of force is something you need in notching. It concentrates the force better, so yes, it'll punch out a flake easier with squared corners. The reason why I don't use squared corners is because they require a lot of maintenance. You got to keep resharpening. So that's why I don't use them. And for most applications and for most reproductions or points that look like how they were made in the past, use a rounded spatula tool or a rounded flattened flaker. I call it a spatula tool. It's best to have two different spatula tools in your toolkit. One very thin and narrow. Well, it doesn't have to be narrow, but it has to be thin. And one beefier. Okay. Same with natural tools. You can use very thin natural tool notchers on very thin pieces. So you need to have one in your toolkit. But most of the natural tool notchers are fairly thick compared to steel. Because steel will hold up much better. It can tackle tougher materials with a with a thin cross section. You can get beautiful narrow notches on difficult material with metal. It's much, much harder, exponentially harder to get that with a natural tool like a piece of antler. A lot of times it simply will not work unless you have a cooperative stone. Now there's a trick that notchers used in the past, and they still use it today, but I don't see it really used or described as a trick. But I consider it a trick because it works well, although it does look attractive. People don't usually consider it to be a trick of the trade because it looks like it's an ornamental thing. But actually, if you widen the notch as you go inward, it makes it easier to keep going. And the aesthetically pleasing part is secondary. Expanding notches are one way to create a narrow notch in the beginning on very thick material. Okay? So I consider it a trick of notching and not something really specifically done for aesthetics. It's done so you have less chance of stalling. And I'm grinding this part or braiding that part because it was starting to I was catching my finger on it. I don't want to cut myself on it. Okay, so expanding the notch allows you to go deeper because it allows you to develop that platform at the bottom of the notch better or with more potential than if you were extremely narrow. The wider the area is, the easier it is to press off a flake somewhere on that edge. If you mess up or if it's too thick on one side, like right here, inconsistencies in thickness, which is another area people want to know about. How do you notch through an inconsistent area? The wider the bottom of the notch, the easier it is to tackle those inconsistent areas, or actually anything related to notching. The wider you are, the better. If you want to start narrow and then widen out, that's perfectly fine. And a lot of people do. They want to know how to do that. I can do that sometimes, but I end up, like everybody else, hitting the sides unless I use some sort of vertical attack on the base of that notch. And usually with a tool that looks like a pointed flaker instead of a spatula tool. Although you can use a spatula tool on a vertical attack on a widening notch. But most experienced knappers will use some sort of vertical technique with a pointy tip. But I'm going to show you the sloppy way, because you can hit the sides by accident very easily, on how to notch using an expanding bottom of the notch. Okay, so here we go. Let's see. What I did was, if you widen it, try to square off the edges, or how do I say this? Try to square off the sides of the bottom of that notch. Square off, make sure this is as square as possible and not too rounded. Square it off. That gives you more surface area at the bottom of the notch for attacks. It's like having a continuous platform. You can attack somewhere along the bottom of that notch, and hopefully somewhere it'll release and you'll get a flake. So what I did was, on this, I widened this, and I'm seeing an opportunity or a good angle to the platform in the middle there. So I'm just going to press in the middle, see what happens. I can rest the tool on the top, or I can bite in and press downward. Rest the tool on top and press downward. One of those two ways, depending on how it felt as I was working. You try both methods as you're notching. Okay, here we go. It felt okay by digging in and then pushing down. So I'm going to try that. And if not, I'll try the other method. And I'll go back and forth between methods and see which ones are more productive. I'm going to try to bite into it with the bottom edge. This rounded part right there. I'll bite into it using that part right there. Just a regular pressure flaking stance. It's sometimes better to use EC stick so you can get a lot more leverage. You can use your legs to push against the sides of your hands, which is a good idea for notching so you don't get napper's cramp. I'm going to do that a little bit here. I'm going to use some force from my legs because that's pretty thick. It's getting pretty thick. Okay, here we go. And this is a relatively thin flaker for this, but sometimes they work really well, especially with the metals. Okay, here we go. So I pushed in with quite a bit of force, and I directed the Hertzian cone inward. The force is inward, like a 45-degree angle. Down and in with the same amount of pressure is the easy way to think about it. You'll produce a Hertzian cone that's going in at a 45, and you'll get an elongated arc instead of a perfectly round arc. If it's perfectly round, you have the possibility of this edge of the Hertzian cone extending out past the edge and blowing away the edge. So I pushed inward enough so that the edges of the cone do not intersect the edge of the workpiece. Now this is not as vital in the later stages of the notch. You have to worry about other things like snapping across the neck, for example, or too much force, or sloppy handling of your tool that blows away some of the sides, that kind of thing. You don't have to worry too much about the Hertzian cone thing. The Hertzian cone thing is dangerous in the beginning. Okay, so now that I've popped that out, the edge is fragile, so you scratch it. In place of abrading, you scratch it. So what you're doing is you're abrading with the tip. You're scratching downward to get rid of the delicate areas and make it dull. And try to square it off or make it wide as possible. You can make it expanding if you want, if that's the type of point you're after. It just depends on what you're going for. And again, in the beginning, be careful about those Hertzian cones. If you're expanding the notch, you push too hard in the corner and create a cone, it'll wipe out that pointy spot right there. It'll just wipe that out. You don't want that. You want to narrow entry if you can. That doesn't keep expanding as you go inward because you're hitting the sides. See, I'm hitting the sides and it's expanding as I'm going inward. I lost some off of this edge, I think. But for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to try to create a bulb, a negative bulb on that side. There's already one on this side I showed you here. I'll try to create one now on this side by pushing out a big old, well, relatively large flake. Okay, here we go. Still doesn't seem dull enough. You'll know with experience, with a little bit of experience, how dull it can be. If it gets too dull, it'll stall. You won't be able to push off a flake. If it's not dull enough, it'll just crush, and you'll get step fractures and stuff, and then it might lead to stalling because you can't get past the step fractures. You want a nice clean pop out. Okay, here we go. I'm going to use the same part of the tool, which is the lower part. Should flip this over. Use the more rounded one for biting into it and pushing inward and downward. Okay. So there. I did a nice clean pop out. The cone is elongated and not perfectly circular. You know, it's an oval shape. Sometimes you can run long flakes into this area using this technique, depending on the convexity. Right now it's pretty flat. If it's convex, sometimes you can run long flakes, and that's part of the advanced technique where you're thinning at the same time you're notching. But in many cases with new guys, you really have difficulty just notching without having to worry about trying to thin at the same time. Right? So I'm just going to show you basically the easiest way. Just keep the bottom of that notch wide so that you have an opportunity to not only try different areas, but you can actually see how it looks. You can see the edge quality much better if it's like this edge here. You know what I'm saying? If you have a circular area, that's not a good example, but if you have a circular area at the bottom of your notch, it's difficult to see the angle of it. The angle of the platform, because that is a platform. Hard to see the angle of the platform unless it's wide. You know, it should be wide enough so you can see the angle of that platform. All right, here we go. I'm going to try another pop out. Nice clean pop out, same method as before. Okay, and right in the middle. That pop out wasn't as clean because I got a little step fracture right there. Clean means no step fractures at all and a nice pop out. But, you know, I can live with that. The reason why there was a step fracture there is you're going into a thicker area, or I'm going into a thicker area. One thing I didn't mention, and it's one of the things that I learned early on and adopted that I don't see very many people doing, or that didn't in the past. Not many people were doing this. Was using domed pads that are domed, so that when you're doing this and you're pushing extremely hard, you don't have pressure on this side and that side to snap it across. It's especially important if you have a narrow neck on your arrowhead. If you don't have a domed pad, or at least flat, the chances are you'll be bridging it or putting pressure on either side of that, and then you're exerting a whole lot of pressure because you're working on a thick piece, and you'll snap it right across. So it'll either go straight or diagonally or somewhere where you don't want it to go. Okay, so it's unnecessary. Use a domed pad, and I tend to use the end here like this, and not across the largest flat area, but across a smaller area so that I'm not bridging it. One more, and then that'll be the end of this segment. Okay, one more flake. Let's see if I can get a good clean pop out this time again. It looked a little bit too weak. Okay, here we go. Should hear a nice clean snap. Nice clean pop out, no step fractures. The cone directed inward, although it doesn't mean too much at this stage because the cone probably won't be bigger and it won't intersect the side when you're this far in. Okay. Okay, we're at the end of the 30 minutes. The thickness is starting to get difficult, right? So the thickness, 4 millimeter, we're starting to approach the thickness of the piece. So if you widen out the notch to 4 millimeters, you'll have a lot easier time producing a flake. Okay? All right, I'll continue on the next segments. This is probably going to be a several segment series in order to do a deep dive on this stuff. Okay.